It was just after dawn when the first call came through to dispatch. A woman had been found slumped inside her car in the quiet parking lot of an apartment complex in College Park, Georgia. The scene was silent, almost eerily so, except for the faint hum of early morning traffic in the distance. But silence didn't mean peace. The woman's body was motionless, riddled with bullets, and blood stained the seat. Paramedics fought to keep her alive as she was rushed to Grady Memorial Hospital, but the outcome was already written in those first few minutes. By the time she arrived, she was gone. That woman was TeeTee Dangerfield, just 32 years old, full of life, love, and dreams. And in a single violent instant, her name would soon be on headlines across the country. Her death, the 16th known killing of a transgender woman in the United States that year. But on that morning, before the cameras, before the outrage, there was only a haunting image, a young woman's life cut short, and a trail. So who was TeeTee, and why did her life end in such a brutal way? To understand the tragedy of her last moments, we have to go back and walk through her story from the beginning. TeeTee Dangerfield was born in 1985, and from her earliest days, people around her noticed something about her spirit, a radiance, a spark that seemed unshakable. Her friends described her as someone who lit up every room she entered. She was the one who made people laugh after a long day, who noticed when someone felt invisible, and who carried herself with a confidence that seemed effortless. But that confidence was not easily earned. TeeTee grew up in a world that often questioned or rejected her identity. As a black transgender woman in the South, her existence alone was an act of courage. Still, she refused to shrink or hide. She embraced who she was, living openly and unapologetically, even when that meant putting herself in danger. She worked in the service industry, where her energy and charm were impossible to miss. Behind the bar or waiting tables, she had a way of making everyone feel welcome. People gravitated to her warmth, and those who knew her best say she poured love into everyone around her, even when she didn't have much left for herself. But like so many others in her position, TeeTee's life wasn't free from shadows. There were whispers of relationships that weren't always safe, of late-night calls that left her uneasy, of moments when her smile seemed to hide more than it revealed. She rarely opened up fully, but those close to her sensed the undercurrent, the quiet tension of someone balancing joy with fear. On the night of the 30th of July, 2017, TeeTee had plans like any other woman her age. She went to the 50-yard line, a popular College Park bar, where music pulsed and drinks flowed late into the night. Surveillance cameras caught her leaving around 3 a.m., laughing, her stride relaxed. Nothing in her body language suggested what was about to happen. What happened in the next hour remains one of the great mysteries of her case. At some point after leaving the bar, she drove back toward the Southampton Estates apartment complex. Did she meet someone along the way? Was she followed? Did she invite someone into her car? No one can say for certain. What we do know is that by 4:30 a.m., gunshots rang out in that parking lot. When police arrived, they immediately noticed something strange. Her car was still there. Her belongings were untouched. There were no signs of robbery. No struggle that spilled into the street. Whoever pulled the trigger had one goal: to end TeeTee's life. Detectives canvassed the area, but leads were thin. Witnesses said they heard the shots, but no one saw the shooter. A few mentioned that TeeTee had been speaking with unfamiliar faces earlier that evening, but their descriptions were vague, inconsistent. Without clear evidence, the investigation faltered almost as soon as it began. Still, Those who loved TeeTee refused to let her death fade into the background. The LGBTQ community in Atlanta mourned loudly and publicly, demanding answers, demanding justice. For them, TeeTee was not just another headline, she was family, one of their own. Her murder felt like an attack on all of them. As the investigation slowly moved forward, 3 questions haunted everyone who followed the case. Was this a hate crime, driven by the fact that she was transgender? Was it something personal, a grudge, or betrayal hidden beneath the surface? Or was it something else entirely, something darker that no one had yet uncovered? The answers, police promised, were coming. But with every passing day, the trail grew colder, the silence heavier, and the fear sharper. TeeTee had been silenced, but the mystery of her death was only beginning to speak. And the most haunting part? Someone out there knew exactly what happened that night and they weren't talking. There's a lot more to this story that will leave you speechless. If you find it worth listening to, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. The parking lot of Southampton Estates was still scarred with police tape when detectives began piecing together the fragments of that night. For investigators, the first step was always the same: reconstruct the victim's last known movements. TeeTee left the 50-yard line bar around 3 a.m. Cheerful, alive, unaware that her final hour had already. Detectives searched for surveillance cameras along the route, hoping to trace her car or identify anyone who might have followed her. But the footage offered little. Glimpses of headlights, indistinct figures at a distance, shadows that could have been anyone. The trail grew thin almost immediately, as though the killer had vanished into the night without leaving. What struck investigators was how deliberate the act seemed. Nothing had been stolen. TeeTee's purse and phone were still inside the car. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong, nor was it random violence. Whoever fired, detectives turned to the people who knew TeeTee best. Friends described her as warm, open, and protective. But they also recalled small moments that seemed ominous in hindsight. She sometimes mentioned strange phone calls late at night, numbers she didn't recognize. She had been in relationships that weren't always steady. At times, she felt watched. Though she never gave specifics, none of it was enough to point toward a suspect. But it painted a picture of a woman living with an undercurrent of unease, even as she smiled through it. As word of her death spread, the LGBTQ community in Atlanta erupted in grief and outrage. For them, TeeTee was not just another life lost. She was the 16th transgender woman murdered in the U.S. That year alone, part of a horrifying trend that was becoming impossible to ignore. Vigils were held, candles were lit. Her name was shouted at rallies as a call for justice, not just for her but for every trans woman living under threat of violence. Yet inside the investigation room, progress was painfully slow. Police dug into her phone records, hoping the mysterious late-night calls might lead somewhere. They combed through texts, call logs, social media. They found numbers that didn't match anyone in her circle, but when followed up, those leads dissolved into dead ends. Whoever she had been speaking with either couldn't be traced or refused to cooperate. The forensic evidence offered no salvation. The crime scene had been swept clean by the killer's precision and by the chaos of emergency response. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing left behind that could be tied to a specific person. It was as if the shooter had vanished into thin air, leaving only silence and blood behind. With so little to hold on to, detectives began to wonder: was TeeTee targeted because of who she was? Was this a hate crime, Or was the answer more personal, someone she trusted, someone she let close enough to hurt her? Meanwhile, fear spread like wildfire. Friends of TeeTee whispered about being followed. Trans women across Atlanta double-checked locks, changed routines, and looked over their shoulders in parking lots that once felt ordinary. Her death was not just an isolated act of violence. It was a message, intentional or not, that safety was fragile. Even in familiar spaces, weeks passed, and the pressure on police mounted. Community leaders demanded answers, but every press conference ended the same way, with reassurances that the investigation was active, ongoing, and without new breakthroughs. To the public, it sounded like nothing more than empty promises. Then, finally, a ripple. Detectives quietly began to focus on a name, a man who had crossed paths with TeeTee, whose connection to her life was unclear but suspicious. A man who, according to whispers, may have been with her in the hours before her death. His name, Tyrone Kemp. Was he a casual acquaintance, a secret relationship, or just an unfortunate coincidence? The police weren't saying, "Not yet." But as investigators began piecing together timelines and patterns, one thing became clear. This wasn't just random violence. Someone knew TeeTee. Someone had planned this, and if that someone was Tyrone Kemp, then the story was about to take a sharp and unsettling turn. Nearly 3 weeks after TeeTee Dangerfield's murder, investigators made their first major move. On the 22nd of August 2017, the College Park Police Department announced an arrest. 26-year-old Tyrone Kemp. His mugshot spread across the news within hours, accompanied by headlines that promised justice might finally be on the horizon for TeeTee's grieving family. It felt like the first breath of relief in weeks, a sign that the nightmare might not go unpunished. Detectives were careful with their words. They described Kemp as a person of interest, then as a suspect, though they refused to disclose the details of the evidence tying him to the crime. To the public, it didn't matter. The idea that a killer was behind bars was enough to restore a measure of hope. Candlelight vigils now carried an edge of anticipation. Maybe justice for TeeTee was closer than anyone dared to believe. But the truth, hidden inside police files and court documents, was far less certain. The evidence against Kemp was not the airtight case the community had been led to expect. Much of it was circumstantial. Witness statements that were inconsistent, electronic records that hinted at connection but didn't prove it. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no surveillance video showing him near TeeTee at the time of the murder. What investigators had was, at best, a fragile web of suspicion. Still, prosecutors moved forward. In cases like this, where emotions ran high and the pressure for answers was immense, waiting for perfect evidence wasn't always an option. They built their case around patterns, around the suggestion that Kemp and TeeTee knew one another, that his movements matched too closely to hers, that he had reasons left unexplained. Behind the scenes, however, cracks began to show. Kemp's defense attorneys quickly seized on the weaknesses. They argued that their client had no significant criminal record, no history of violence, and no direct ties to the murder scene. They claimed he was being used as a scapegoat, a convenient suspect to calm the outrage of a community demanding closure. The legal battle stretched on for years. Hearings were delayed, evidence was contested, and the slow churn of the justice system forced TeeTee's family to live in limbo. For them, every passing month without resolution was a new wound, a reminder that justice, if it ever came, was agonizingly slow. Outside the courtroom, the community held firm. Activists invoked TeeTee's name at marches and rallies, insisting that her case not be forgotten. She became a symbol of both grief and resilience, her story fueling the demand for better protections for transgender women. Every anniversary of her death brought renewed calls for justice, each candle lit at vigils, a small act of defiance against the silence surrounding her murder. But as the years slipped by, one question loomed larger. Was the case against Kemp strong enough to hold? Or would the system that had failed to protect TeeTee in life fail her again in death? By late 2021, 4 years after the morning she was gunned down, the answer would finally come in a courtroom. Kemp would stand trial for the murder of TeeTee Dangerfield, and the jury would be asked to decide if the threads of circumstantial evidence were enough to convict him. For TeeTee's family, it was the moment they had been waiting for, the chance to see her killer held accountable. But trials have a way of revealing truths no one expects, and this one would be no different, because when the verdict finally came down, it wasn't what anyone was prepared to hear. By November 2021, 4 long years had passed since TeeTee Dangerfield's life was taken in that College Park parking lot. 4 years of waiting, of vigils, of repeating her name so it wouldn't fade into the background noise of unsolved violence. Now, at last, the moment her family had prayed for had arrived. The trial of Tyrone Kemp was set to begin. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. TeeTee's loved ones filled the benches, clutching tissues, hands intertwined, eyes locked on the man accused of ending her life. For them, Kemp's presence was almost unbearable, the thought that the person responsible for her death was finally within reach of accountability. Every day they had endured since the 31st of July, 2017, had been building to this one. The prosecution presented their case first. They leaned on patterns, on circumstantial evidence they believed painted a clear picture. Witnesses testified that Kemp and TeeTee had crossed paths before, that their lives were entangled in ways not everyone fully understood. Phone records suggested overlaps in movement, late-night calls that hinted at connections left unexplained. The state argued that Kemp's presence in TeeTee's orbit was no coincidence, that his motive may have been personal, even intimate, and that he had both the opportunity and the intent to kill her. But when it came to hard evidence, the kind that could silence all doubt, the case faltered. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no camera footage placing Kemp at the scene of the shooting. What the jury was given was a mosaic of suspicion, fragments of testimony, threads of data, and the insistence that when woven together, they told the story of guilt. The defense seized on those gaps. They painted Kemp as an innocent man dragged into a storm of outrage, someone prosecutors needed to charge because the community demanded answers. They reminded the jury that suspicion is not proof, that patterns are not evidence, and that justice cannot be served by convicting a man on possibility alone. They asked the jurors to consider not just what was presented, but what was missing, and the missing pieces were glaring. For TeeTee's family, sitting through the testimony was agony. They listened as her life was reduced to phone logs and timelines, as her laughter and light were absent in a courtroom that spoke only of evidence and doubt. They had waited so long for this moment, and yet, as the trial unfolded, unease began to creep in. Could this case really hold? When closing arguments ended, the jury retreated to deliberate. Hours stretched into an excruciating silence. Every second felt like a lifetime, each tick of the clock a reminder of what was at stake. And then, finally, the verdict came. Not guilty. The words landed like a thunderclap in the courtroom. Gasps echoed, followed by sobs. For TeeTee's family, it was as if she had been killed all over again. 4 years of waiting, of believing justice would prevail, evaporated in a single moment. Tyrone Kemp was free. Acquitted of the murder that had stolen TeeTee's life, the reaction outside was no less explosive. Community members were stunned, outraged, heartbroken. Some insisted Kemp's acquittal was proof of a broken system that repeatedly failed Black transgender women. Others questioned whether the police had ever had the right man at all, and if not, then who? If Kemp didn't kill TeeTee, where was the real killer? That question cut deeper than anything else. Because the verdict didn't just release one man, it reopened the wound of uncertainty. The parking lot, the gunfire, the silence that followed. All of it remained a mystery. The trial had not delivered answers. It had only deepened the shadows. For TeeTee's family, the emptiness was unbearable. They left the courthouse with tears in their eyes, knowing her case was effectively back at square one. Her killer was still out there, unpunished, unseen, unknown. And for the wider community, the verdict sent a chilling reminder. If justice could slip away so easily here, what hope did they have that their lives, too, would ever be protected? The trial was over. But the story of TeeTee Dangerfield was not, because even in death, she had become more than a victim. She was now a symbol of love, of courage, of a fight that refused to be silenced. But what does it mean when a symbol outlives the truth? And how do you honor someone whose story ends without resolution? The answers lie in the aftermath, in the legacy TeeTee left behind, and the haunting questions her death carved into all of us. The courthouse steps were wet that day, not from rain, but from the tears of those who had come to hear the verdict. The air felt heavy, like the weight of history pressing down on everyone present. For TeeTee's family, the trial's end was not closure. It was a cruel reminder of how far justice had slipped from their grasp. They walked away with their heads low, clutching photos of her, as though holding her image tight might keep her spirit close. For them, the verdict was not freedom for a man, but a second death for their daughter, their sister, their friend. And for the community, it was yet another headline in a grim pattern. Another Black transgender woman killed. Another case unresolved. Another family left shattered. Vigils sprang up almost immediately. Candlelight flickered against the night sky as voices cracked with emotion, chanting her name, TeeTee Dangerfield. Friends remembered her smile, her way of making everyone feel welcome, her dream of owning a business where people like her could feel safe. They spoke of how she refused to hide, how she lived her truth in a world that often punished honesty with violence. But the vigils were not just memorials, they were protests, too. Activists and community leaders pointed out the brutal numbers. TeeTee had been the 16th transgender woman killed in 2017 alone, part of a devastating national trend. Each case, they said, was not isolated, but connected by threads of prejudice, hate, and systemic neglect. For them, TeeTee's name was not just another tragedy, it was a rallying cry. They demanded accountability, not just for her, but for all the lives lost under similar shadows. Yet even as her face appeared on banners, her story shared in marches and campaigns, one truth gnawed at everyone: her killer was still free. That reality haunted the people closest to her most of all. They remembered the late-night phone calls TeeTee once mentioned, The cryptic messages. The way she sometimes seemed uneasy but brushed it off. Had those been warnings? Had she known, deep down, that danger was closing in? Or were those details just fragments, coincidence mistaken for meaning? The absence of answers left her loved ones circling the same questions, night after night. If Tyrone Kemp wasn't the man responsible, then who was? Why had they done it? Was it hatred of her identity, or something more personal? And perhaps the darkest question of all, would they ever be caught? Years passed, and still the case lingered, cold but not forgotten. TeeTee's family kept her memory alive, attending marches, speaking her name, reminding the world that she was not just a statistic. She had been flesh and blood, laughter and hope, dreams and light. She had been someone who mattered, and that's what made the silence so unbearable. The unanswered questions didn't just haunt her family. They haunted everyone who dared to look at her story and see a reflection of something larger. Because TeeTee's case was never just about one woman's death. It was about what it meant to live authentically in a world that too often punishes authenticity. It was about whether justice truly protects everyone, or whether some lives are valued less than others. It was about the cracks in a system that allows killers to vanish into the night, leaving families with nothing but grief and the echo of what might have been. Her death was unsolved. Her dreams were unfinished. Her case was unresolved. But her story? That still burns. And maybe that's the cruelest, most powerful part of all. TeeTee Dangerfield lives on. Not in the life she was supposed to have, but in the questions that her death forces us all to confront. So what do we do with a story that ends without answers? Do we let it fade into silence? Or do we hold it like a torch, demanding light where darkness has lingered too long? The truth is still out there. And until it is found, TeeTee's story will never rest. The candles have long burned out, their wax hardened into ghostly remnants on sidewalks and church steps. The crowds have gone home, the headlines have shifted to newer tragedies. But for TeeTee's family, the silence has only grown louder. They wake each morning to the same absence, the same unshakable knowledge that the world moved on, while their world never could. Her mother still keeps her room as it was, as though she might walk through the door again at any moment. The clothes folded neatly, the perfume bottle half used, a pair of shoes resting by the bed, all of it frozen in time, untouched, except for the moments when grief overwhelms her, and she sits there, holding on to what little is left. For her friends, the loss lingers in other ways. A missed phone call, an empty seat at the bar, a laugh they still hear in their memories, but never again in real life. Some of them confess that they sometimes forget, even for a second, and expect to see her name light up their phones. And when it doesn't, reality crushes them all over again. But TeeTee's story did not vanish. Her name lives on in advocacy groups, in community spaces, in marches where her face is carried high among others taken too soon. She became both a symbol and a reminder. A life cut short, but not erased. She is invoked in speeches about violence against transgender women, cited in reports, remembered in vigils each passing year, and yet the same wound remains. The man once accused of killing her walked free. The justice system declared there wasn't enough evidence. And so the file sits, unsolved, growing colder with each passing season. Somewhere, perhaps, the truth still walks among us. Somewhere, someone knows what really happened that night in her car, parked outside those apartments in College Park. Was it a lover turned violent? A stranger driven by hate? A deal gone wrong, or a plan too carefully executed to leave traces. Each possibility is a knife that never stops twisting. For her family, the cruelest part is not knowing. Not knowing why. Not knowing who. Not knowing if justice will ever come. And for all of us, her story raises a question much larger than one case. How many more TeeTees will it take before change arrives? How many more families will have to mourn in silence? How many more killers will walk free because the lives they took weren't given the full weight of justice? Perhaps the hardest truth to face is this. TeeTee Dangerfield's life was not supposed to be defined by her death. She was supposed to grow old, to see her dreams flourish, to keep making people laugh, to love and be loved. Instead, her name is etched into the long list of women lost too soon, women who deserved safety, dignity, and the simple right to live. And so her story does not end here. It lingers, waiting for an answer, waiting for justice, waiting for someone, somewhere, to finally break the silence. Until then, all we can do is remember her, speak her name, and carry her light forward, because forgetting her would be the final injustice. TeeTee Dangerfield's story is unfinished. And maybe that's the point, because as long as her case remains unsolved, the responsibility falls on us to keep asking, to keep demanding, and to never let the world look away. So I leave you with this. If the person who took TeeTee's life is still out there, living free, what does that say about the world we live in? And how long will we allow that silence to last?